Alright, good morning, or evening, or afternoon, or wherever you are. Today we're going to be discussing some memory lane stuff. To explain further, let's talk about humanities a bit. Something that binds the collection of works we've seen this semester, actually something that arguably binds any humanities works you might ever see, is that each work has some take on human society. This is such a general statement, I know, but it does indeed apply. Statements and stories on business, religion, government, education, and human rights. This is all contained within human society. What specifically is said about this and why it's important is to be explained through our past readings. Basically, to explain further, we're going to go down memory lane. Yup, meaning we're starting with the original Castaway. No, not that one. There we go. Robinson Crusoe. As you hopefully recall, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe was a story written as if it were a true tale of a stranded sailor in the late 1600s. There are numerous aspects of how this relates to human society, especially since Crusoe makes his own societal rules once stranded. In the beginning of the novel, Crusoe rejects the life his father wanted for him in search of a life on the sea, setting up implications for an economic message. When he becomes the only survivor of a shipwreck, he becomes more devout in worshipping God and treating the people native to where he was shipwrecked as beneath him, setting up implications for a religious and human rights message.
Friday, I'd like to talk to you about God.
Finding and creating what he needs to survive, Crusoe lasts there for 28 years. Once he's found, he doesn't end up with what his father wanted, he's still devout, and he still treats the natives, well, Friday, as beneath him. Essentially, he doesn't change much in relation to society after his shipwreck experience, despite the opportunity to come up with his own rules during his estrangement. So perhaps people carry what they know of their own societal rules wherever they go, even when they're in places with different societal structures. Next, we jump to Candide by Voltaire, where the main cast travels to several places. While the majority of the work has a humorous slant to it, the outcome of all the events of the story leads to a rather unhappy end, at least for the characters. Although everyone is together in the end, they're all unhappy, due to what happened to them that, unlike with Crusoe, greatly changed their mindsets. Pangloss no longer believes in his own ideas, Cunegonde is ugly, Candide believes work is dignified. It's certainly an experience over theoretical exploration kind of story, as it starts with everyone together, everyone breaks apart in the middle, and then everyone comes back changed. The most major change of note is what Candide believes about work. At the beginning of the story, work is bad, but by the end, it becomes dignified and even part of the last few phrases of the story. This appeals to the business side of society, where the lesson is, well, work is dignified. Candide kinda just outright said that. But there's also some hints to Voltaire's awareness of religious injustice, such as how Candide and Pangloss were to be killed in an auto-da-fe to stop more earthquakes from happening. Overall, Candide presents a story where the characters are greatly changed by their experiences in several places away from where they started, indicating that their societal values were changed by the introduction to new perspectives. Speaking of religion, let's get to Nathan the Wise, by Gotthold Lessing, a tale of religious tolerance and love. The play is fairly direct in its lesson. Some of the characters are Jewish, some Christian, and some Islamic. The Christian Knight Templar wants nothing to do with the Jews until he realizes that they're indeed human as well. Interestingly, Nathan the Wise has been described as anti-Candide for its leaning towards showing the wonderful instead of gore, or love instead of hate. While the play may seem more about religious tolerance, it shows more about love, as tolerance is closer to indifference, while love marks importance.
Your Excellency, just supposing a Jew would raise a Christian adopted daughter as a Jewess, what would happen to him? And the patriarch goes, well, we'd invite him to a merry little bonfire.
So while this story also addresses religion and society, it's a very optimistic portrayal of how things could be rather than how they are. Or were. Then we get to Diderot's work, the Encyclopedia, which is not at all a novel, or play, or anything you think you could pull themes of society out of. But wait! We can! After all, what are the Encyclopedia? Literally a bunch of pages made by a bunch of people detailing tools, technology, and human innovation. Essentially, the Encyclopedia are the culmination of education and business in human society. On top of that, it indirectly speaks on religion in society by unnerving the church authority. At the time the Encyclopedia were created, the church gave information to the people, but with these, the people could gather information on their own without the church's help. Isn't it interesting how there's still themes on human society despite not explicitly talking about it in the Encyclopedia text? Let's take a 180 and get out of that, because Adam Smith details his thoughts on protection of property and sympathy quite clearly. Protection of property falls under the government section of our human society categories, as he details that where there is great power, there comes great responsibility. Wait, wrong quote. Adam Smith says that where there is great property, there is also great inequality. That's it. He continues to say that because of this, there's a necessity for protection of property in civil government. He even goes so far as to say that civil government is first necessary due to property. In case you can't hear the neon green sign of those words, I'll put it here for you. This is one of his main points on government and human society, at least in this text. In addition, he talks a lot on sympathy between human beings, which vaguely falls under the human rights category. As Adam Smith describes sympathy for another human being, I can't help but think this must mean they wouldn't want the other person to suffer, otherwise they'd feel the suffering, right? So why did slavery come into existence? Anyway, I can't ask Adam Smith that, so maybe consider what he might say as a response to that. Another writer who says their points rather straightforwardly is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Yes, he's the one who detailed his version of human history and the foundation of society. Need I say more on how that ties into my point that every one of these texts involves human society? Another writer of note is... wait, isn't this where we would have read Basic Writings by Kant? Well, too bad we can't talk about it. Next, we have Lauda Equiano's life story, detailing the events of his time in slavery and living past it. What's interesting about this narrative is that I can spot all 5 of our categories on human society, at least in an obvious sense. In being a commodity as a slave, buying his freedom, working on ships, and selling commerce, Equiano deals with business throughout the story, and adopting the belief in God and using the Bible to have hope in life and the afterlife, Equiano explores commonality in different religions. In his experiences with not having defense against white people who treat him unfairly in daily life and trading, he deals with living with a government that doesn't favor black people. In learning to read and write, he notices how his awareness expands in correlation with his knowledge from education. And of course, with going through slavery and the inequalities in life associated with being black in a white privileged society, Equiano explores issues with not everyone having equal rights. Perhaps I'm biased in how fleshed out I'm describing the narrative, as it's one of my favorite readings from the semester, but I do see all 5 of these aspects as prominent in the story. I wonder what that says about the other material we've read, as this is the first work we've read by a black man from this time. Perhaps the ones who can speak the most and be aware the most of human societal mindsets are the ones who aren't completely accepted in society. This is a lot of remembering and questioning to process, isn't it? I'll provide some music for you to take a break from thinking if you'd like. This is actually what I'm listening to while I'm recording this, so I will provide some cute animal pictures to encourage you to actually take the break. If you'd still prefer not to, just skip the next few minutes. Alright, back to describing the memory lane stuff. Let's start a revolution. No, not the Les Miserables kind. That comes later in history. Although I wouldn't be opposed to adding pieces of that to the Hume 220 syllabus. But enough on that. We'll talk that later. The French Revolution information we receive from various sources, including the Old Regime and the French Revolution, Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and a short history of the French Revolution, include primary and secondary sources which describe the history of the area of time when the French Revolution happened. This shows societal elements such as government and human rights through the events that happened. The people weren't happy with the government and how the majority of people were treated as lesser than the higher classes, so the vast majority of people wanted a complete rewrite of the system. This resulted in the Terror, which shows that people can get violent during change. Yes, these are very simplistic descriptions for a historical set of events so vast and complicated, but perhaps saying it simply might be the best way to put it to string it together with the other texts we've read thus far. If we want to continue on human rights, let's discuss Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. Now we go back to a rather Rousseau tone, with the author describing their argument directly. Only in this case, Wollstonecraft uses more actual situations she's witnessed, rather than theoretical situations for her argument. While the title of the book includes Rights of Woman, she includes the categories of education and business as well as human rights. Largely, she argues that providing education and opportunity to participate in business for women will improve the value of society, as women hold back society otherwise. Going more into human rights like Wollstonecraft, but going back to a writing style like that of A Short History of the French Revolution, we read The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. Here we learn about the Haitian Revolution, which resulted in the abolition of slavery, giving an example of how people will fight for their freedom. It also describes racial capitalism, a mode of production developed in agriculture, going into the business side of societal mindset. As the abolition of slavery was largely overlooked by Europe, looking at you, UK, claiming you abolished slavery first. Anyway, we can see that the events described in this text also speaks to the European societal mindset at the time, that white Europeans were the best. So we looked at novels, plays, primary sources, secondary historical sources, encyclopedias. Let's take a look at paintings. Yep, Delacroix's Massacre of Kiosks and the text we read associated with it. Here we discuss human rights and religion. As the text provides the backstory, let's recap a bit. The Massacre of Kiosks basically references the Greek versus Turk conflict happening during the Restoration after the French Revolution. It shows the Greeks largely in a sickly or ugly state, making the victims more frightening than the torturers. This was a strange choice to several people, as the royalists didn't know who exactly to support during this time. Do they defend 400-year-old Ottoman rule against revolutionaries, or champion Christianity over Islam? There's the religious aspect to all this. Anyway, in the painting, there's also a mixed-raced figure who's painted as male despite being based on a female model. That's a Spacey. She's a mixed-race young woman who embodied the sullying of whiteness due to being the result of heterosexual conquest. You know, content warning, the result of a white man raping a black woman. Delacroix found fascination in a Spacey largely for this idea, and reenacted it. This plays into the inequality that black and mixed-race women faced in comparison to white men. The mindsets of men like Delacroix made that inequality and perpetuated it. So let's take human rights in a different direction, as in how to tell if someone is human. We recently read The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffman, a tale on people potentially being puppets and their sight being taken away, damaged, or questioned. After Olympia is found to be an automaton, it became commonplace in society to do things to prove they weren't also automatons. It was a thing to prove that they were indeed human. On top of this, the main character brings up the motif of questioning humanity by questioning who wrote their poem and referencing a wooden doll as he tried throwing Clara over the railing. In this way, the meaning of the human rights category takes a slightly different turn than the other cases of this in previous texts we've read. In previous cases, the people knew they were human, but being deprived of things that other humans have. In this case, the people don't necessarily know if they're human, and if they should be ostracized due to lack of humanity. A strange case, but certainly something to think about hypothetically. More on hypothetical human rights cases, let's talk Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, possibly one of the reasons you took this course. Through the story of an almost mad scientist bringing a creature to life that isn't quite society's standard of beautiful, Shelley describes situations involving human rights and education.
Quite a good scene, isn't it?
While the human rights applies to the creature similarly to the automaton case in The Sandman, is the creature human and should they be ostracized? The education category applies both to Victor and the creature. Victor renounces modern science in his education, opting instead for the more archaic and magical, which results in the creation of the creature. The creature, on the other hand, takes what they can get, learning to read on their own and watching how people act. This almost reflects how people of color had to learn at the time, taking what education they could get and doing their best with it. Another point I've heard is that the creature resembled neurodivergent kids, who are very intelligent but are often neglected or abandoned by their parents, Victor being the parent for the creature's case. The education and human rights tie together quite seamlessly here, unlike how the creature is portrayed in modern media. Get it? You know, because there's often, thread showing. Forget it. It wasn't a great joke. So we finally get to another famous author, Karl Marx. In his writings, he often bashes capitalism for being a good way to demotivate workers, alienate laborers from their products, etc. In addition, though, he criticizes German philosophers for being too religious. Yeah, I didn't know about that part until we read it a few weeks ago. Anyway, that provides two of our categories, business and religion. I'm sure there will be more as we read, but since I'm writing this lecture for you a couple weeks before it's due, I don't have definitive thoughts on writing I haven't read yet. Hopefully you can take these categories and think about it on your own. Wow, that's a lot of reading we've done. And this is just the major stuff. There's a few sources we've looked at that I didn't even point out. First off, let's take a moment to feel impressed with yourself for reading all of, or most of, these works. Alright, moment finished. So what's the point? Why bother pointing out these 5 categories that are part of human societal mindsets and finding the hot takes about them in each of these works? We'll get to that. First, let's put this in perspective of time and place these were produced. We largely read these in chronological order of history, mostly by when they were published or when the historical event described was. Robinson Crusoe was an English work, originally published in 1719. Candide was a French work, published in 1759. Nathan the Wise was a German work, published in 1779. We've already hit the big 3 countries in this course, and it's only the first 3 works we're reading. Next, Diderot published the French Encyclopedia sometime between 1751 and 1780. Adam Smith's Scottish The Theory of Moral Sentiments was published originally in 1759, while the book we read containing both that and The Wealth of Nations, The Essential Adam Smith, was published 1987. The 3 French works in the major political writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau were originally published in 1750, 1755, and 1762. Olaudah Equiano published his English narrative in 1789. The French Revolution events discussed took place around 1789 to 1799, and the English work, The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, was published in 1792. Although The Black Jacobins was published in 1938, the events described take place around 1791 to 1804. The article we read on Delacroix's Massacre of Kiosks was published in 2008, but the French painting was created in 1824. We then go to The Sandman, a German work originally published in 1816. After that, we have Frankenstein, an English novel published in 1818. Finally, The German Ideology was written in 1845 to 46. In this semester, we've pretty much gone over a century of European, mostly English, German, and French, history, all the way from 1719 to 1846. What a time. Note the types of works these are too. Robinson Crusoe, fictional novel; Candide, a fictional novella; Nathan the Wise, a play; Encyclopedia, Tiles of Innovations; Adam Smith's writings, argumentative text; Jean-Jacques Rousseau, argumentative text; The Interesting Narrative of Olaudah Equiano, autobiography; French Revolution, historical events; A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, argumentative text; The Black Jacobins, historical events in secondary source form; Massacre of Kiosks, painting; The Sandman, fictional short story; Frankenstein, fictional novel; and Karl Marx's writing, argumentative text. We'll come back to this in a moment. Through these works, we see the change in societal mindset at that time, as well as challenges to societal mindsets, largely through the categories identified: business, religion, government, education, and human rights. What can we do with this, though? What does it matter to identify these categories? Well, one application is to perhaps figure out what works would fit into a humanities course. You guessed it, we're going to test this out, by seeing if we can apply another work to this course. Which one? Why, Les Miserables, of course. Les Miserables was first published in 1862, which not only is a bit of time after the last reading we do for the first semester, but also past Madame Bovary, one of the second semester Hume 220 books published in 1856. Although this is the case, I'm going to pretend that this could tag on to the end of the first semester without giving regard to the timeline of the second. That way, we can focus on seeing if this example could work as a Hume 220 work to study according to our parameters. Spoiler alert, I think so. This elaboration is mostly for you to see if you might think so. Les Miserables fits around the general time period of this course and is a French novel, fitting with the time and place of the first semester of this course, Europe in the 1700s to 1800s. It would be easy to say no to adding this book if it didn't work out with either of these parameters. Same with it being a fictional novel. We discussed before that there are different types of works in this course. We have 4 argumentative texts, 2 fictional novels, 2 historical events, a fictional novella, a fictional short story, a play, an autobiography, a painting, and Tiles of Innovations, plus a few others that we didn't identify in this lecture. Les Miserables is a text that fits within the fictional novel category, and as there is still a decent balance between the fictional texts and the non-fictional writings with this edition, it could theoretically work as another Hume 220 piece to examine. Now, let's get to how it works as a humanities text in general, bringing back our societal mindset categories as we go over a simplified plot, no spoilers, well, little spoilers, of Les Miserables. The story covers the interactions and stories of several people in Paris from 1815 to the 1832 June Rebellion, primarily focusing on the life of the ex-convict Jean Valjean. Right at the start of the story, the poor Jean Valjean steals silver candles from a bishop. Although the bishop could have admitted to the police that Valjean stole the candles, he instead states that he gave Valjean the candles, and proceeds to give him more silver. The bishop's kindness changes Valjean, inducing him to change his identity as a mark of becoming a new person with a clean slate. In this time, Valjean turns to God due to the bishop's kindness, exploring the religious side of society. After a few years of Valjean living his new life with a new name, the police officer Javert becomes suspicious of Valjean. Without offering spoilers, let's just say these two have an important interaction throughout the story, and this interaction leads to a questioning of morality and government. If you'd like to see this unfold, I'd recommend reading the book. Further into the story, we meet the Friends of the ABC, an association of revolutionary French Republican students. These youths fight the French government by joining in the June Rebellion by forming a massive barricade which they fought at. Everyone who fought there died. Keeping in mind that those who fought are students, there's some aspect of education that can be explored here. By the end of the story, so many tragedies and struggles have occurred for all of the characters. As the title of the story is aptly Les Miserables, or The Miserable Ones, depending on how you translate it, it really focuses on the characters and how horrible it was to be human and poor during that time. In terms of human rights, this explores a different perspective than the previous works we've talked about. If almost everyone described is equally miserable, then what does the difference among the students, police, mayor, bishop, and everyone else make in terms of enhancing the quality of life for everyone? After all, isn't it the goal of honoring everyone's rights as a human to improve the quality of life for everyone? Perhaps I'm wrong to question that. Maybe I need a Hume 220 conference to discuss these things. Anyway, as the work provides another take on at least one of the 5 categories of societal mindset, I would consider this not only a humanities text, but one that should be discussed in classes such as Hume 220. As the work is long, perhaps sections of it would be best to cover over a week or so. Well, now that we've explored one text with these categories, I challenge you to find a text that you would consider good for humanities which doesn't explore business, religion, government, education, or human rights. Or perhaps find another category to add to these 5 that I missed. Either way, I hope this trip down memory lane helped you realize how much you've absorbed in the past semester and gave you some tools of evaluating texts that are good for humanities discussion. Have a great day.